Hello, my name is Wilson McElveen. I grew up in First Presbyterian Church, but having left there after I graduated from high school in 1982, I have not been a member since then. I was brought up in the Presbyterian faith and attended First Presbyterian Church while growing up there. At the time I was born in 1959, my parents attended Swan Lake Presbyterian Church in Sumter. I think they had working on a mission to try and get that church established. Of course, we only lived a few blocks away from Swan Lake Presbyterian Church, and before we'd moved our house on Guyton Street, they lived on Kenilworth Drive, which was also close to Swan Lake. I was baptized there probably in 1960, and I have no recollection of ever attending this church, and I'm not exactly sure when my parents transferred their membership back to First Presbyterian. We'll say that my father had grown up, my father, who was Ashby Bubba McElveen, he grew up attending First Presbyterian, and his parents were also members there. My mother, who had grown up in Miami until she moved back, or until she moved to Sumter at the end of 1939, she had attended services at Tirzah Presbyterian Church in Dalzell. Both of her parents were from Dalzell, and this is the church that they grew up in. My parents were married in the little chapel that faces Main Street in May of 1951, and both of my sisters were married in the big sanctuary, in the main sanctuary, and I, of course, was married in Beaufort, South Carolina, at the First Presbyterian Church there. So we were all married in the Presbyterian Church. My grandmother, who was Caroline Reese McElveen, had been a member of First Presbyterian Church from the time she moved to Sumter with my grandfather in 1923. She was a regular worshiper during her lifetime, but my grandfather, who owned a drugstore on Main Street in Sumter, he had to work 7 days a week, so he really was not able to attend services very regularly. In 1935, he sold his business and opened up a car business. And so he did get at least 1 day a week off, but I still, even after then, don't think he was as regular of a worshiper as my grandmother. My grandmother had been brought up as a Methodist, and but of course he was from a long line of Presbyterians, and she joined his faith. My mother, who had attended a different church, her family, go back to the 1850s. Her family was attending church at First Presbyterian, but many of them left there when they formed the Tirzah Presbyterian Church in Dalzell in the 1870s. I will say that as I was growing up, we were truly what I like to refer to as the frozen chosen, because when I came along, worship was very traditional and solemn, and as far as I could tell, never really changed its format. Only men served as ministers back then. Only men served as elders. Only men served as deacons, and only men were the ushers. The women, their leadership roles came in their participation in the circles, the women's circles, and an affiliation with the women of the church. There were women who were, when I was coming along, who were director of Christian education, but overall it was, traditionally the men that had the leadership roles. Dr. Cliff McLeod was the only minister I ever knew when I was growing up for many years, and he served the church as the single pastor. Now, when I was in my early adolescence, we had our first assistant minister. His name was Mike McGee, and I remember that my parents were very fond of him. Deacons back then were elected for a specific term, but elders were elected for life. So it really is no wonder that changes were only gradual back in my youth. The only controversial occurrence that I ever remember was during the 1960s, when efforts towards integration of all sectors of our society was taking place. Some black folks came to our church one Sunday morning, but were turned away by the ushers at the door and not allowed to come in. The reason given by the ushers was that this was a place of worship, and they felt that these folks were only there to make a political statement. Perhaps they were only there to worship. That could very much be true. But for the most part, blacks and whites had not worshiped together in the same sanctuary in Sumter County since 1865. And that's for the most part. There was a lot of racial tension in the community at that time. And even as a child, I could feel that tension existed. Some members of the congregation were very upset that these folks were turned away, but I believe that most in the church, my impression was they supported what had happened. Dr. McLeod supported the action of the ushers, and I do recall that it caused quite a stir, and that Dr. McLeod actually received letters of condemnation for his support of this, literally from around the world. Dr. McLeod was a very learned man, as most Presbyterian ministers are, and I will admit that the messages in his sermons were, for the most part, beyond my comprehension or understanding. So I'll admit I did not pay very much attention to what he was saying. He always wore his black robe, and as I recall, hardly ever missed a Sunday that he was leading us in worship. We attended Sunday school at around 10 a.m. in the morning, and church services began at 11 a.m. There were never more than one service at that time. In worship, every Sunday, we had a responsive reading that was, I believe, in the red hymn book. We sang the doxology, we recited the Lord's Prayer, and the Apostles' Creed. We didn't do other creeds, we just did the Apostles' Creed. And the Apostles' Creed back then did not include the phrase, "and he descended into hell." I had learned it without that phrase being in there, so I still have to remember every time I say it that I have to include that. The choir led us in singing, with the talented Mr. Scobie playing the organ. Mrs. Duffy, a wonderful soprano, was sure to glorify God with her incredible voice. And the ushers, again, were men only, passed the collection plates downstairs, and boys typically collected the pledges in the balcony. One thing you could count on back then, as I'm sure even today, was that the same families sat in the same pews almost every Sunday. My family and I always sat in the middle back pew of the balcony. My father liked to pass mints along to the other congregants in the balcony, and it was a welcome treat for many of the same families who sat in the balcony every Sunday along with us. From up in the balcony, you could see only about 2/3 of the congregation in attendance below. I could never see where my grandmother was sitting, but I always knew she was there. At some point, I believe we were in the 4th or 5th grade, we were encouraged to memorize the child's catechism. My grandmother helped me to learn the questions and answers. And I would spend some time with her, and then after I'd learned it or we'd recited it, I would go to Mrs. Brogdon's house on Folsom Street, Mrs. Betty Brogdon, and then recite to her that and show her that I indeed did know the catechism. I remember the first question, what is God? God is love. I remember this experience with great satisfaction and with great fondness for the kind instruction and encouragement of Mrs. Brogdon. What a gift she was. What a gift she imparted on all of us children who were fortunate enough to share this with her. I remember that we were not allowed to take communion until we had been confirmed in the church, which was, I believe, in the 6th grade. Communion was only given a few times a year, and the elders passed the cut cubes of bread and grape juice that were in the little cups, and they passed those down the aisles. We were never served communion by intinction, and never at the pulpit or the altar. I also remember with pride when we were recognized as being high school graduates at the baccalaureate service at the end of May, my senior year in high school. Most families followed a routine for dinner after church services that was only altered after the invention of modern conveniences such as the microwave oven and the crock pot. In our family, we went out for dinner after church only one time a month. The rest of the time we ate at home. And I look forward to those Sundays that we ate out because I was able to order one of my favorite foods, which was fried chicken. My father had grown up eating fried chicken every Sunday after church, so he objected to eating it on Sundays as an adult. Like most families of the day, on the Sundays we didn't eat out, before we left for Sunday school and church, my mother would have placed a pot roast in an electric skillet with carrots and potatoes made with a gravy that would be ready to eat after we got home. Just thinking about it makes me hungry. When I was of middle school age, I often complained to my parents about having to go to Sunday school and church as going to both, because I found it to be, I hate to say, rather boring for me, but my father relented and decided to let me choose. I could either go to Sunday school or church, but I had to go to at least one. I chose Sunday school whenever I could, but I had to be able to catch a ride home from someone as my parents would be going to church. My father used to help me find these rides home, and I remember riding home many times with cousin Bobby Burgess or with Mr. and Mrs. Nick Moes. It was usually a very entertaining ride. Mrs. Seal Moes was always full of conversation, and when she told me she had grown up in Abbeville, South Carolina, just like my grandmother, I knew that I understood the common link between the two. When I told my father that if you were from Abbeville, it must mean that you have to talk a lot, he burst into laughter as he knew as well as anyone what I meant. I will always fondly remember my experiences here at First Presbyterian and worshiping in the sanctuary, which at the time had blue painted walls and large palladium windows with purple stained glass panes. And we faced the large stained glass window of Jesus praying at the Garden of Gethsemane, which other than I think the color of the church, that's all pretty similar. The organ, of course, was in a different format or structured differently around the stained glass than it is back then than it is today. But I will say, many of the traditions and doctrines of our church have changed, and the sanctuary has been improved over the years. But thanks to the nurturing of the congregation, teachers, and leaders, I can confidently look back at this firm foundation as I have moved forward in my own life's journey of faith. Thank you.